August 26th, 1071. On the plain outside Manzikert, an emperor's banner reverses. A simple order to pull back. But from a distance, through dust and dying light, it looked like something else. Defeat. Within minutes, a rumor was tearing through the ranks. The emperor is dead. That rumor would do more damage than any Seljuk blade would manage that day. The army camped outside Manzikert was, by most modern estimates, the larger of the two forces on that field, and not by a small margin. It had heavy cavalry. It had the Varangian Guard, soldiers considered nearly unbreakable in close combat. It had an emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, determined to win back a frontier his empire had spent years losing to a new power sweeping out of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. By dusk, that larger army would not fall because it was outfought on the field. It would fall because, at the one moment it needed to move as a single body, it stopped trusting itself. So what actually brings down an empire that had stood for 1,000 years? The enemy's spear? Or its own ranks turning on themselves? This is Manzikert, the Battle of Byzantium lost to itself. None of it started at Manzikert. It started with a single fortress most people outside the empire had ever heard of, falling 7 years earlier, and a door that never really closed again. By the middle of the 11th century, the Muslim world was fracturing from within. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had spent decades weakened by Sunni-Shia conflict, and out of that vacuum rose a new power, the Seljuk Turks, a Central Asian people who had converted to Sunni Islam early in the century. Within roughly 30 years, the Seljuks had conquered Iran, then Iraq, brought the Caliphate itself under their protection, and pushed directly against both the Fatimid Caliphate to the south and the Byzantine frontier to the west. At the head of this expansion by 1064 stood a new sultan, Alp Arslan, a name that, in Turkic, means heroic lion. Byzantium, for its part, had just come through one of its rare periods of recovery. In the middle of the 9th century, the empire had clawed back territory across the Balkans and Anatolia. But that recovery had a cost. The buffer zone that once separated Constantinople from its Muslim neighbors was gone. In 1064, Alp Arslan's forces captured Ani, a major center of Christian Armenia and, according to Encyclopaedia Britannica, a critical strategic loss for the empire's eastern defenses. The chain of fortresses Byzantium relied on to hold that frontier began to fail, fortress by fortress. By 1067, Turkish raiders were striking the outskirts of Antioch and Melitene, and the city of Caesarea had been sacked and burned to the ground. The road into the Byzantine heartland stood open, and it would not close on its own. If that road stayed open, it would not just be a frontier province at risk. It would be the empire itself, its recruiting grounds, its tax base, the whole eastern half of what remained of Rome. That same year, Emperor Constantine X Ducas died. His widow, Eudokia, needed a soldier on the throne, and to check the ambitions of the powerful Ducas family, one of the empire's most entrenched aristocratic clans, she married a battle-tested general from Cappadocia named Romanos Diogenes. Romanos became emperor with one overriding goal: recover the lost frontier. He moved quickly. As early as 1068, he led an expedition east and managed to retake the city of Hierapolis, a modest but real success. It was not enough. Seljuk raiding parties kept probing deeper into Anatolia, and by 1069 they were striking as far as Iconium, well inside territory Constantinople considered secure. Romanos began assembling a far larger force, determined that his next campaign would settle the Eastern question for good. He was not a cautious man. Early in 1071, while Alp Arslan was occupied besieging the Fatimid-held city of Aleppo, the Sultan sent word proposing to extend the truce between the two powers. Romanos accepted. On paper. In practice, he was already preparing an entirely different campaign. A direct strike at the Seljuk-held fortresses near Lake Van, aimed at closing that open road for good. The army Romanos marched east was, by design, a patchwork empire in miniature. Alongside the Imperial Guard and the Anatolian frontier troops rode Norman and Frankish mercenaries from the west, Pecheneg and Cuman horsemen from the steppe, Armenian infantry, and, critically, contingents of Turkic mercenaries fighting under the Byzantine banner. Serving Constantinople was profitable work, and emperors had long been able to hire the best soldiers medieval Europe and Central Asia had to offer. On paper, it was an imposing force. In practice, it was an army held together by pay and circumstance rather than shared loyalty. A detail that would matter far more than anyone marching out of Theodosiopolis that spring could have guessed. And here is where the emperor's confidence turned into something more dangerous. As his army advanced, Alp Arslan, now aware the Byzantines were on the move, offered peace terms once more. Romanos, certain his numbers gave him every advantage, refused to negotiate. According to several accounts of the campaign, he pressed forward, determined to settle the matter by force rather than by treaty, confident that a single decisive battle would do what a decade of raids and truces had not. It was not the confidence of a careful strategist. It was the confidence of a man who had never yet met the general he was actually about to face. While Romanos marched, Alp Arslan did something no Byzantine commander had planned for. He abandoned the siege of Aleppo entirely, turned north, and drove his army toward Anatolia at a pace Byzantine scouts could not match, moving so quickly through hostile terrain that his own allies barely had time to fall in alongside him before Anatolia came into view. Byzantine reconnaissance, built around slower infantry columns and fixed supply lines, simply lost him. Speed and secrecy were the Sultan's real weapons here, not numbers, and certainly not the heavy cavalry Romanos was counting on to decide the field. Then Romanos made the decision that would define the entire campaign, long before either army reached the battlefield. Somewhere on the march toward Manzikert, he split his forces in two. A large detachment, by most accounts somewhere close to half of everything he had gathered, was placed under an experienced general named Joseph Tarchanaiotes and sent toward the nearby fortress of Akhlat, while Romanos led the rest onto Manzikert itself. It seemed, at the time, like a reasonable use of a large army. Secure two objectives instead of one, and close off any route Alp Arslan might use to slip past the main Byzantine force unnoticed. What happened to Tarchanaiotes' force next is one of the more disputed footnotes in Byzantine history. Muslim chroniclers claim Alp Arslan's forces struck and scattered it. Byzantine sources barely mention it at all, which, historians studying the campaign have pointed out, is itself telling. What both traditions agree on is the outcome. When word reached Tarchanaiotes that the Seljuk Sultan's main army was somewhere near, his force withdrew from the campaign entirely, retreating back toward Byzantine territory without ever engaging the enemy. Modern historians such as David Nicolle, who has written specifically on this campaign, treat the withdrawal as a deliberate decision rather than a defeat or an accident of miscommunication. Romanos sent riders to recall him. By the time they found the road Tarchanaiotes should have been on, he was already gone, and so was roughly a third to a half of the emperor's entire army. Here is the open loop worth holding on to. Tens of thousands of Byzantine soldiers, men Romanos was counting on to help surround and crush the Seljuk army, had just vanished from the campaign before a single major blow had been struck. No dramatic defeat, no headline disaster, just an army that quietly stopped existing, one march order at a time. Would the emperor even notice they were missing before it mattered? Romanos pressed on regardless, still confident, still expecting the numbers to work in his favor. On the 25th of August, his advance scouts finally located the real Seljuk army near Manzikert, smaller in appearance than he had feared, which only deepened his confidence. A short skirmish followed. It went badly enough for the Byzantine detachment involved that some of the emperor's own Turkic mercenaries, watching the Seljuks up close for the first time, quietly deserted to the other side that same night. Men who, it turned out, felt closer kinship with the army across the field than with the empire paying their wages. By the time the two main forces finally squared off near Manzikert, Romanos had no real idea how much smaller his fighting strength had actually become. He believed he still commanded the larger army on that field. He did not. On the morning of August 26th, the two armies drew up for a battle. Neither side had fully planned to fight this way. Romanos organized what remained of his force into 4 bodies. At the center stood the Varangian Guard and Armenian infantry, under his direct command. On the flanks, mercenary cavalry, Turkic, Syrian, and European. And behind them all, a reserve force under a general named Andronikos Doukas. That name should already sound familiar. Doukas was tied by blood to the same family Romanos had spent his reign trying to keep in check. The family whose power he had curtailed simply by becoming emperor at all, placing a Doukas in command of the one force held in reserve. The one force that could save the day if the front line broke, was either an act of trust or an act of carelessness. History would not be kind about which. Facing them, on open, rolling ground east of the fortress, Alp Arslan arranged his Seljuk cavalry in a crescent, its 2 horns pushed forward, its center held back under the Sultan's own command. His force was almost entirely mounted archers, light, fast, built for a battle that moved rather than one that stood still and traded blows. If you have watched this channel's video on Canny, that crescent shape may look familiar. Set it aside for now. What kills this army will not be a closing ring of cavalry. Alp Arslan sent envoys forward one final time, offering peace. Romanos refused, confident that his reserve would return in time to help encircle the enemy. He had no way of knowing that reserve had already vanished from the campaign. What followed was not the single decisive clash medieval battle paintings tend to promise. It was hours of Seljuk horsemen riding in, loosed arrows in tight volleys, and wheeling away again before the heavier Byzantine cavalry could ever close the distance. The classic hit-and-run rhythm of steppe warfare, repeated again and again through the heat of the afternoon. Byzantine cataphracts, armored for a head-on collision, found themselves chasing an enemy that simply refused to stand still long enough to fight one. The Seljuk center kept falling back under pressure, drawing the Byzantine line further and further from its own fortified camp with every advance. Whether that retreat was a calculated lure or simply how these horsemen always fought when pressed is something modern historians still debate. The surviving accounts themselves do not fully agree, and no single source settles the question. By mid-afternoon, the Byzantine formation Romanos had drawn up that morning barely resembled itself. The center had pushed forward. The flanks had stretched thin, chasing an enemy that kept dissolving in front of them. And somewhere behind all of it, a reserve force under a man with every private reason to see this campaign fail was watching the gap between the emperor and his own protection grow wider by the hour. Romanos pushed forward anyway, determined to force a real engagement. By late afternoon, his troops had overrun Alp Arslan's own camp. It looked, for a moment, like a Byzantine victory in the making. Then the sun began to set, and Romanos made his final decision of the day. Turn back, regroup at the fortified camp before darkness made the retreat impossible to control. The signal for that order was simple and well understood by every soldier in the Imperial Guard. The Emperor's banner turned to face the opposite direction. To the troops around Romanos, it meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. Pull back, in order, together. To the units on the flanks, spread thin and far from the center, it meant something else entirely. From a distance, in dust and fading light, a banner suddenly reversed, looked less like an order and more like a collapse. And into that gap walked Andronikos Doukas. He was the son of Caesar John Doukas, and by 1071 the Doukas family had a decade of accumulated grievance against the man now signaling for help he badly needed. Whether Andronikos genuinely believed the emperor was dead, or simply saw an opportunity too convenient to waste, No surviving source can say for certain. What the sources agree on is what he did next. Rather than moving his reserve forward to cover the retreat, he turned his own men around and marched them back toward camp, spreading word, deliberately or not, that Romanos had fallen. One decision, made in minutes, by a man whose personal politics had nothing to do with tactics at all. The rumor moved faster than any cavalry charge. Byzantine units that had held formation all afternoon, men who had marched hundreds of miles, who had watched their own comrades desert the night before, who had every reason to believe the worst the moment they heard it, began breaking apart, each one acting on second-hand panic rather than orders from anyone still in a position to give them. Some simply turned and ran for Manzikert. Others stood frozen, unsure whether the battle was already lost or about to be won. The Seljuk flanks, watching this unfold from a distance, stopped feigning retreat and closed in for real. The center, the Varangian Guard, the Armenian infantry, the emperor himself, was now alone on an open field and surrounded on every side. One eyewitness account, later preserved by the Byzantine historian Michael Attaleiates in his History of the Period, described the collapse in stark terms: the shouting, the dust, the sense, in Attaleiates' own words, that the disaster was beyond any mourning or lamenting. It was not the enemy's arrows that produced that reaction. It was the sight of an entire imperial army coming apart from the inside, in full view of the men still trying to hold it together. The Varangian Guard, the soldiers considered nearly unbreakable at the start of this video, fought until they no longer had a line left to hold. Romanos stayed in the fight himself, wounded, refusing to abandon his position even as the ground around him emptied of anyone still willing to defend it. Eventually, an ordinary Seljuk soldier, not realizing who he had found, took him prisoner. The Emperor of Byzantium, the man who had marched east certain of victory, was now a captive of the army he had come to destroy. What happened next is, by most accounts, the strangest part of this entire story, and the part that makes it hardest to file Manzikert away as a simple tale of a stronger army losing to a smarter enemy. Alp Arslan did not humiliate his captive. According to several accounts of the meeting, he treated Romanos with real courtesy, by some descriptions even sharing meals with the man whose army he had just destroyed. The two negotiated terms over the following days. According to the World History Encyclopedia, Byzantium would cede Manzikert itself along with the cities of Antioch, Edessa, and Hierapolis, pay a ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces up front, follow it with an annual tribute of 360,000 gold pieces, and seal the arrangement with a marriage between the two royal houses. Within about a week of the battle, Alp Arslan released Romanos and sent him home under an honorable escort, as though the two men had simply reached the end of a long negotiation rather than a catastrophic defeat. The enemy, who had just shattered his army, captured him, and could have made an example of him, instead treated him better than his own capital was about to. A contrast the story's earliest tellers noticed too. While Romanos was still making his way back toward Constantinople, the Ducas family finished what Andronikos had started on the battlefield. They declared the emperor deposed and placed Michael V. Ducas on the throne in his place. The same family whose reserve force had refused to save him, now claiming the crown he had left the capital to defend. Romanos tried to fight his way back to power anyway. He lost, in a short civil war that dragged into 1072. Captured a second time, he was blinded, the standard punishment reserved for a deposed Byzantine emperor, and died not long afterward from the wounds of that punishment. Alp Arslan, the man who had every reason to want Romanos gone for good, had let him live and go home with an honor guard and a signed treaty. The empire Romanos had marched out to save turned on him within weeks of his release, and finished, with astonishing speed, the job the Seljuks had never actually needed to finish themselves. Territorially, the damage took years to fully show, but it was permanent. Turkoman settlers began moving into Anatolia in the decades that followed, and the region Byzantium had drawn its soldiers, its taxes, and its food from for centuries, never came back under lasting imperial control. According to the World History Encyclopedia, Manzikert itself was not a catastrophic defeat in casualties or immediate territory lost. It became the psychological watershed after which Byzantine power entered a long, slow, and largely permanent decline. Many historians see this defeat, and the political chaos that followed it, as one of the developments, not the only one, but a significant one, that pushed Byzantium toward asking Western Europe for military help. 24 years later, in 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to Pope Urban I asking for exactly that kind of aid. What came back was far larger than Alexios had asked for, the First Crusade. If Tarchanaiotes had turned back toward the battle instead of away from it, if Andronikos Doukas had marched his reserve forward instead of home. Historians cannot rerun the campaign to find out what changes and what does not, and that is precisely the point. Nothing about Manzikert was inevitable. An empire that had absorbed disasters for 7 centuries came apart. This time, over a signal 3 units misread and one man's decision not to help. So, what actually brought Byzantium down that day? Not Seljuk numbers. By the time swords crossed, the 2 armies may have been closer in size than either commander realized. Not a tactical genius on the other side, either, even though Alp Arslan certainly was one. Byzantium's own army stopped functioning as one army, twice in a single campaign, before the enemy ever needed to land a decisive blow. 353 years before Manzikert, this same empire had stood at the walls of its own capital and held off a Muslim siege at Constantinople. That defense worked because, when it mattered, the city held together. Manzikert did not fall at any wall. It fell on a distant plain most people in Constantinople could not have located on a map. And the cracks opened there would not fully close until the walls of that same capital finally gave way. Close to 4 centuries later, the door Manzikert opened led somewhere specific, toward the Crusader states, and toward one of the strangest battlefield upsets this channel has ever covered, where 500 knights, outnumbered more than 50 to 1, did something almost nobody watching that campaign thought was possible. That story is next.